Welcome to the Renegade Nutrition Podcast, where we discuss all things wellness.
I'm Eleni Welch, nutritionist.
And I'm Kay Boyer, health enthusiast.
Welcome back, Renegades. Welcome to another episode of the Renegade Nutrition Podcast. We have Dr. David Brownstein here with us today. And as you may notice, my podcast partner, Kay, is not with us. So I will do my best to be as lively and entertaining as Kay is and as focused and research oriented as I am, and try and give you the best of both worlds. But we are so excited to have Dr. Brownstein on today. Dr. Brownstein is a functional medicine practitioner. Is that a good way to put it?
Sounds good.
Yeah, excellent. And we're going to have a conversation today about salt. So, Dr. Brownstein, if you wouldn't mind, could you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your practice and what it is you do, and then we'll dive into our questions.
Well, thanks for having me on, Eleni.
Yeah, you bet.
So I've been practicing medicine for about 30 years.
Okay.
And I've been practicing what I consider holistic medicine for 29 years and 6 months.
Okay.
We have a busy office in West Bloomfield, Michigan, which is just outside of Detroit. And we have 6 practitioners. One of them's my daughter, and my other daughter's coming soon when she finishes her residency.
Oh, awesome. That's really cool.
We enjoy what we do, and we're most of us are family practice trained. We have one emergency doctor, and we do a lot of work with bioidentical hormones, with diets, with detox, just trying to help people reach their optimal health and to recover from illness and to get everything balanced in their body. That's kind of been our thing for the last 30 years, and it's been a good ride.
Yeah, I love it. That's awesome. Well, we need more practices like that, and I really that's awesome that you guys are such a large practice, and you'll be kind of a family business too, which is really cool. Obviously, your work has inspired your family and your daughters, so that always, I think, speaks for itself. But tell us a little bit about your story. So were you always a more holistic medical doctor, or did you start out as a conventional medical doctor? And if you switched at some point, what led to that transition into more holistic medicine?
Well, Lainey, I went to med school. I wanted to be a doctor since I was little. And I went to the University of Michigan for undergrad, geared my undergraduate training towards getting into med school. And then I wanted to go to med school to be modeled after my family doctor. And we came from a conventional household. We didn't do any vitamin therapies. We didn't do anything holistic.
Yeah.
We went to the doctor when we were sick. We never questioned what they said. And we basically took whatever they recommended, and that was it. And we didn't see alternative practitioners in my household. So when I got into med school, I was pretty of a conventional mindset.
Yeah.
And through med school, I don't recall questioning anything that I learned. And I bought into all of it. And I thought drugs could cure anything and could fix anything. And I did my residency in family practice. And I questioned one thing in that residency, and that was the chickenpox vaccine when it came out.
Mm-hmm.
I just questioned the need for it.
Yeah.
And since chickenpox was a benign illness, and I also questioned, hey, I remember talking to my preceptor about it. I said, hey, if we give these moms, if we start using this chickenpox vaccine, people are going to lose their immunity to chickenpox. How do we know this thing's going to last a lifetime? And then when these young girls, these baby girls get pregnant, and they're, whatever, and they have their babies, are those babies going to be protected against chickenpox like they were if you had chickenpox, a natural case of chickenpox?
Mm-hmm.
That was the only thing I questioned in 4 years of med school and 3 years of residency.
Yeah.
And I remember talking to my advisor, and I said, well, I'm not going to recommend that chickenpox vaccine. I don't see the need for that. And that was the only thing I did differently. Otherwise, I did it all.
Yeah.
I graduated from my residency, and I took a job near where I'm at now, working for, a family practice group. And around 6 months into that practice, I started to feel anxiety bubbling up from nowhere. I was negotiating and buying for a partnership. Practice was getting busier. I was making a good salary. I was married and baby was on the way. I wasn't stressed about that.
Yeah.
And I started to lose sleep for a few nights in a row
Hmm.
for unknown reason. And I remember getting up, getting ready to go for work. And I told my wife, Allison, I don't want to be a doctor anymore.
Hmm. Wow.
I was 6 months into practicing. And at that point, she'd known me since we were 18 years old. We met at the University of Michigan. And she only knew me when I talked about was being a doctor. I didn't talk about anything else.
Yeah.
And I felt that was my calling back then. I mean, I still do now, but I
Yeah.
practice a better form of medicine now.
Yeah.
Um, and we owed $100,000 in student loans, which I, paid for my schooling. And she, first comment was, you know, the second comment was, well, what are you going to do about it? And
Yeah.
uh, she, I said, I don't know, but I can't do this for the next 30, 40 years. I said, I'm not helping anybody. Just giving
Wow.
drugs that treating symptoms, and then I'm giving more drugs to treat the symptoms from the first drugs.
Right.
And I said, very few people are getting help from what I'm doing. And I could see it in the long run.
Yeah.
And she said, well, what are you going to do? And I'm like, I don't know. And she goes, why don't you do another residency? And I'm like, no, one of those was enough. And so I was floundering.
Yeah.
And at that time, my father was really sick with heart disease. He had his first heart attack at 40, his second heart attack at 42.
Wow.
Over the next 20 years, he had 2 bypass surgeries, numerous angioplasties. He was on 12 medications to treat diabetes, hypertension, and heart disease.
Wow.
He looked awful. He was pale and pasty and was having continual angina for 20 years, popping nitro pills like they were candies.
That's insane.
And we were all waiting for the phone call that he had died.
Yeah.
Just waiting for the phone to ring. And so maybe that was part of that. And I went to work that day after telling her I didn't want to be a doctor anymore. And one of the first patients I saw that day was the husband of a woman she worked with,
Hmm.
and she carpooled with to work, Allison. So we were friendly with them. We'd done some social things with them, and he kept bothering me about his chiropractor and how good his chiropractor was. And he brought it up again at this office visit. And he said, you really need to meet my chiropractor. He's saved my life. And it
Hmm.
wasn't about adjusting him. It was about the nutrition that he helped him with.
Mm-hmm.
So in my anxiety and lack of sleep, I said, I'll take his number. And I took his number and I called him. And then we set up a dinner meeting the following Tuesday. And at that point in my career, I never had met a chiropractor. I didn't know what they did. I never referred to a chiropractor. I used to tell patients don't go see them because even though I didn't know what they did.
Yeah.
And that's what we were taught.
Yeah. I worked with a chiropractor and we got that all the time from
So,
patients was like, yeah, my doctor told me not to see you anymore.
totally taught that.
Yeah.
So I Tuesday rolls around. I work that day and come home. I said to Allison, I'm going to cancel this. It's a waste of my time. What's a chiropractor going to do for me? She goes, no, it's too late. You already said you're going to meet him. You need to go. And as I'm walking out the door, she told me to be nice. And
She sounds like a good woman.
she is. I go to dinner. He's a nice guy. He's a smart guy. He's talking to me about functional biochemistry like I had never heard before. And he's talking to me about using nutrition to optimize human biochemistry, which I had never heard before.
Hmm.
He was really bright, and his name was Dr. Robert Radke. We hit off a friendship right off the bat, and he brought me a book to that meeting, Healing with Nutrition by Dr. Jonathan Wright, who's an allopathic physician. So I came home from dinner, got home about 10 o'clock. I was really charged up and telling Allison all about it. I said, I'm going to stay up and read this book for a bit. So she goes to bed. I was up till 2:30 in the morning reading that book, and I really focused on the heart disease section because of my dad.
Yeah.
So the next morning before going to work, I think this was before cell phones, I called my dad and I said, hey, can you stop in the office this morning? I want to get some blood work on you. And based on what I talked about Dr. Radke with and what I read in that book, I drew 2 blood tests on him. One was testosterone levels and the other was a thyroid levels.
Hmm.
And when I got the results back a couple days later, his testosterone levels were below detectable limit it was so low, it was somewhere near zero. And no one had bothered to check that. And there's a whole plethora of literature on low testosterone causing and aggravating heart disease and
Wow.
testosterone therapy treating heart disease. And then there's a whole nother facet of research dating back 100 years that over 100 years that hypothyroidism is directly associated with the development of heart disease.
Hmm.
So my dad's thyroid levels were in the reference range, but in the lower part of the reference range. So I put him on two things right when I got that blood work back. I put him on natural thyroid hormone and natural testosterone. And within 7 days, he called me up and he said, I'm not using any nitros today.
Hmm.
And his 20-year history of angina melted away. It never returned. Never
Wow.
used another nitro. Within 30 days, when I rechecked some other levels, his cholesterol on medication fell below. On medication was in the 300s all the time. And my dad was not a great patient. He smoked. He could eat like the best of them, never exercised a day in his life.
Yeah.
But without changing any of his bad habits, his cholesterol fell below 200, just getting his physiology in better shape.
Wow.
And once I saw that, and then he looked better, he acted better. His face went from pale and pasty to pink and healthier. His friends were calling up my mom and asking her, "What are you doing?" He looked so much better. Um, Once I saw the changes in him, I went to the partners and I said, "I need to leave. I'm not
Hmm.
going to become a partner." And they said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "Nothing's wrong. I need to. I want to go do holistic medicine." Um, they said, "What's that?" And I said, "I don't know." I said, "But I'm going to have to figure it out." And they said, "Well, why don't you just do it here?" And I'm like, "No, I can't do it here. I need an office. I need people answering the phones. I need people pulling the charts. I need people, nurses. I need whoever in
Yeah.
that office on the same page,
Yeah. Right.
um,
Buying into it.
same energy, same page."
Yeah.
And so Allison's due for my first daughter, who's in my practice now, is um, maybe she was really pregnant then, maybe a month or two later, ready to have that baby.
Wow.
And, you know, um, so I left that practice and just, she was supportive. Allison never put pressure on me. She said, "We'll make it work." And I said, "Look, if I have to, I'll go work 8 hours in the night." I didn't care.
Yeah.
Um, and so here I am 30 years later. I'm still trying to figure out what holistic medicine is. I got a better idea now. But as close as I can be to it, I'm there. And I have an office that's there. And, we're doing the work and we're walking the walk and we're talking the talk. And it's been a great ride. Uh,
Wow.
and it's made medicine fun and interesting and, wouldn't change a thing. I would change a thing. I would have gone to if I would have known earlier, I would have gone through med school and residency with a holistic bend in my eyes. And,
Yeah.
um, but that's the only thing I would change. Otherwise, it's been a good ride and glad I'm there and glad I'm still doing it.
Yeah. Wow, what an amazing story. And honestly, I think the fact that you started out conventionally and were more conventionally minded, just in a way, it lends credit to the holistic approach, because I think when somebody has seen both sides of the coin, then you feel like, okay, there's a reason they made that shift. Something happened, right? Whereas when somebody starts out that way, it's easy to be like, well, they always just believed that. For people who don't buy into holistic medicine already as it is, it's easier, I think, for them to write off somebody if they don't think they've already been more conventionally minded. In my opinion, I see that a lot, that it seems like people who were on the conventional path and then switch seem to get a little bit more credibility.
And my experience has been most people who switch, either they're sick, a family member's sick, or a friend is sick, and the conventional side isn't helping much.
Yeah.
And then they find something else. And usually that's the case. Now, it's a little different now with the internet. There's a lot more, I don't know about in medicine, but there's a lot more interest in the public in it. And
Mm-hmm.
I remember 30 years ago when I started doing it, I mean, I didn't know what it was. People didn't know what it was. And, um, you know, I feel lucky enough and blessed enough that my patients sort of stuck with me and we kind of learned about it together. And, you know, I've written a bunch of books on it and, I do the best I can do. And, again, it's been a great ride and I would do it again.
Amazing. Yeah. And you have quite a number of books out. And I'd love to link the page too in our show notes so that our listeners who are hearing this podcast, if they want to read more of what you've written, they can easily find those books. So I'll be sure to do that. And there's, one thing in particular that we're going to talk about today, which is salt, which, having heard your story now, I feel like I could ask you 1,000 unrelated questions to salt, but but we'll focus in on salt. So maybe talk to us a little bit about, it sounds like you see sort of any health condition in your practice. What made you start doing research on salt and the benefits of salt?
So I guess we're going to talk about salt. We'll start with iodine.
Yeah.
And so after treating my dad was my first patient. I always said he's my first and my best patient.
Yeah.
And even though he could eat and smoke like the best of them and, carried around a little bit of extra weight there, and didn't exercise a day in his life. Everything I tell my patients to do, he did the opposite of that stuff.
Yeah.
But anyways, so after treating my dad, every patient including up till now, gets a hormonal nutritional evaluation. Every one of them, no matter what their complaint is, what they come to me for.
Yeah.
And so I started diagnosing a lot of thyroid problems when I started looking for it and testing appropriately for it versus what I was taught in med school was, very rudimentary.
Yeah.
So within the first 10 years of my practice, I would estimate I had about 3/4 of my patients on some thyroid hormone, some natural thyroid hormone.
Wow.
And the dose was an average, I would guess, of about 2 grains or 120 milligrams of this natural thyroid hormone. Now, I thought I was doing a good job. They seemed to be getting better. My practice was growing. Patients seemed happy. I seemed happy. I was writing books on it. I'd written a book on thyroid, overcoming thyroid disorders. I'd written a book on hormones, The Miracle of Natural Hormones. That was my first in 1998. And it was bothering me why I had 3/4 of my patients on thyroid hormone to feel good.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I thought we had a pretty good design from our maker that if we supply the right nutrients to the body can take care of itself in most situations.
Right.
And I still feel that way.
Yeah.
And so why were so many people needing to take a prescription of thyroid hormone to feel good?
Yeah, it's a good question.
So I would look at the physiology of the thyroid gland and what it takes to make thyroid hormone and the cofactors and the nutrients. And, I'd read things of like magnesium, selenium, vitamin C, B vitamins, all important for making thyroid hormone. And you can't make thyroid hormone without that from the thyroid gland, which sits in the lower part of our neck. You'd also read about iodine, and the highest concentration of iodines in the thyroid gland. The thyroid hormones contain iodine atoms attached to them. T4 thyroxine has 4 iodine atoms attached to it. Triiodothyronine, T3, has 3 iodine atoms attached to it. So you can't make a thyroid hormone. You can't make any hormone in the body without iodine, including sex hormones, adrenal hormones, ovarian hormones, or any of them.
Right.
So I would fool around with iodine, and I would try people on iodine. I live in Michigan.
Yeah.
So Michigan is known as right in the middle of the goiter belt of the United States.
Right.
If you draw a line from the Great Lakes on down south, that's the goiter belt of the U.S., where the soil is known to be one of the most iodine deficient areas of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Goiter refers to a swelling of the thyroid gland, which was common in the early 20th century and 19th century when settlers were moving from east to west across the United States, and Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois were being settled and growing in population, and there was a huge amount of goiter in the center part of the United States. So at that time, it wasn't just humans suffering swollen thyroid glands; it was animals. The animals were also iodine deficient because the soil and water was iodine deficient. And so the animals not only had messed up thyroid glands, but they weren't growing correctly. And they weren't procreating correctly and growing correctly. So they weren't making their optimal weight size. And there was a concern from the highest levels of our government that the population growth in this goiter belt was going to outstrip the food supply because they were in problems procreating the animals. So a study was done in Cleveland, Ohio, outside of Cleveland, Ohio, by oh my goodness, who was that doctor's name? It'll come to me. By a physician out of Case Western University's medical school, who who was who wrote a paper on iodine when he was a med student. So the government um, they didn't sanction him. The government called him to do a study and to figure out what's the least amount of iodine you could add to animal food so the animals can procreate correctly and grow to the right size. And so he put different amounts of animal feed, different amounts of iodine in animal feed. I believe it was pigs.
Mm-hmm.
Found the smallest amount that corrected the problem of iodine deficiency. From that, he estimated the amount of iodine that per body weight for the animals that would be for humans to prevent the goiter epidemic. So they put iodine into salt because it was an easy process to do, and they recommended for Americans to take, a small amount of salt in their daily diet, and they'd get some iodine in the goiter belt. And the first studies were done in Michigan and Ohio, and they found that goiter rates dropped dramatically as soon as they did this.
Right.
So the U.S. government or mandated, or I don't know if they mandated or highly strongly recommended that iodine be added to salt for the rest of the country, and that's where the RDA for iodine came from, the recommended daily allowance, the minimal amount needed to prevent goiter for the vast number of people.
Right.
Now, it's not just the thyroid that needs iodine. The ovaries, uterus, breast, pancreas, thyroid, thymus gland, all needs iodine as well.
Right.
And as I said earlier, you can't make any hormone in any gland of the body without enough iodine.
Right.
So the RDA was set up to prevent goiter. It's not an optimal amount of iodine.
Right.
It's an amount of iodine.
Yeah.
So the RDA was successful. It was really one of the first public health miracles in our country, where you made an intervention and a problem was relatively rectified.
Yeah.
And it was a problem in animals and a problem in humans, and the goiter epidemic, I wouldn't say it was resolved because it's returned itself now because iodine levels are falling again. But
Right.
at that point, the goiter epidemic was largely resolved, and people forgot about iodine, and they just went about their business. We didn't really see people with big things sticking out of their neck, and we controlled the food supply, and the animals were procreating and growing correctly, and we
Right.
could feed the population. So, of course, now I'm in the weeds, Eleni. The question was, what did you
I love the weeds.
Did you give me a specific question, or am I going? Oh, going to salt.
Yeah,
So,
but that's okay. We can keep
okay,
talking about iodine too. So,
salt. But this is how I got into salt. So the first 10 years of my practice, I try selenium, I try magnesium, I try vitamin C, B vitamins, and I try iodine. So I wouldn't have to put so many people on thyroid hormone.
right.
And nothing worked as well as putting them on a small amount of thyroid hormone. Patients didn't want to come off their thyroid hormone because they felt good.
Yeah.
And their labs were okay. I didn't feel like I was doing anything wrong. But it was bothering me.
Yeah.
And then in one of my journals, a physician, Dr. Guy Abraham, wrote a letter to one of the journals saying he developed an iodine test. Now, for the first 10 years of my career, there was no great iodine testing available. And I saw this letter. I called him up. He was interested in my practice because of where I was located, the goiter belt, the low iodine in the water and soil.
Mm-hmm.
So he offered to start testing my patients with me and teaching me how to do the tests. So he was in California. He is one of the smartest human beings I've ever met. He's up there as one of the top two physicians I've ever met, smartest physicians. And we began, he taught me how to do bench research and how to test for iodine, how to, we would study together. I'd fly out to Santa Monica probably every other month. I was going out there for a long weekend, spend in the lab, and it would be grueling work. We'd work hard. And so Dr. Abraham taught me that the form of iodine I was using wasn't correct, and I needed to use a combination of iodine and iodide. That can be another podcast.
Yeah, I bet.
But once I started using the right form of iodine, I found that I didn't need so much thyroid hormone, and maybe within a few years, I went from 3/4 of my practice on small amount of thyroid hormone to a quarter.
Wow.
I went from an average dose of 120 milligrams to an average dose of 30 milligrams.
Wow. That's
That's what I
incredible.
needed. But everyone needed iodine.
Yeah.
So moving into salt, I was writing this book.
Yeah.
It was one of my books, Iodine, Why You Need It, Why You Can't Live Without It.
Yeah.
And I was near the end of this book, and it was somewhere around, so 10 years into my practice, 2002 or three. I don't want to look at the copyright in there, but this is a fifth edition. I've got one beyond all that. But I was finishing the book, and there was an article in the Detroit Free Press on the health section on Tuesday. And there was a resident dietitian that wrote a column. People would ask questions, and she answered the questions. And I was right near the end of writing my iodine book. I mean, I was in the final edits. And this question came, is there any difference between sea salt and regular salt? That was it. That was the question.
Yeah.
So she wrote, no, there's no difference between sea salt and regular salt. They're both equally high in sodium and should not be used in your diet, should not be added to your food in your diet.
Ugh, God.
Something like that. So I had the first 10 years of practice when I was looking, wasn't just putting people on thyroid hormone. I was looking at how to optimize my patient's biochemistry and physiology. And I drew a lot of blood work. And one of the blood tests I draw is the electrolytes or the salt levels, sodium and chloride in particular, and potassium.
Yeah.
I started noticing that the reference range for sodium and chloride was huge. It was about 140 to maybe 128 or something like that. I don't remember what the bottom number was.
It's a wide range.
It was a huge range. And what I found was that people could be in this range and they said, well, you're in the normal range. Well, that's, it's not a normal range, it's a reference range. But people down here were considered normal in conventional medicine, as people up here were considered normal.
Right.
Well, I can tell you this person is very different than this person.
Yeah.
So I started to find that optimally people did better when they were like buffering the reference range and a little bit higher. So I started putting people on salt, in the first 10 years of my practice. And they got better. They got better with aches and pains. They got better with muscle cramps. They could think more clearly. And I started to really watch my sodium and chloride levels and trying to optimize it in patients and helping them optimize it with recommending salt as a medicinal therapy. And they got better.
Wow.
So I knew salt was working when she wrote that answer to that question.
Yeah.
So I am writing the end of this. I was literally within days. I sent that book to print. And I cut that article out. And I remember it was, a little 4 by, little thing like that. And I taped it on my computer screen. I'm looking at my other computer screen over here. And I taped it up there because I knew what my next book was going to be because of that question and answer.
Yeah.
I either write my books because I get excited about something or I write my books because I get annoyed about something.
Right.
It's some passion going either way. And this was a little bit of both, but I was annoyed at that article. No question. That was a spark for it because some books I have in my head for years before I write them, salt was never a consideration until that book.
Right.
So I wrote my book, Salt Your Way to Health, directly after the iodine book.
Amazing.
And so I hadn't really gone through the history of salt. I had certainly gone through the history of iodine and hormones and thyroid because those were my first 3 books. And to write a book, you got to really dig deep into things. So I didn't know the medical history of salt, but I knew it was working, and I knew what I was taught in med school that nobody needs salt.
Right.
Salt is dangerous. Salt causes high blood pressure.
Mm-hmm.
Salt causes heart disease. Salt, whatever.
Yeah.
And I knew it was nonsense. I was treating my patients with salt, and they were better, and they were happier with it.
Right.
So I started delving into the history of salt right after that iodine book went to print. And one of the things I've learned over time is in medicine, when there's a dogmatic statement like salt should be avoided by everyone, or you get enough iodine in salt, iodine deficiency is a thing of the past.
Right.
There's no difference between bioidentical hormones and synthetic hormones, things like that.
Right.
hear these dogmatic statements that I know through my practice and my ears and my eyes and my brain that is just not true. That when you go and do digging into it, you'll find, you'll go back in time and you'll find that stool that to sit on that you can read about and realize this is how they cut one of those legs out and why the stool doesn't stand anymore, why people don't believe that salt's helpful or iodine's helpful or something like that.
Right.
So salt, I started pulling articles on salt, and the negative articles on salt all reference this study in the early 1970s, the intersalt study. So the intersalt study was this worldwide study of salt intake and blood pressure, and it was undertaken it was funded across the world. There were I can't remember how many centers, like around 20 centers across the world, and they were looking at salt intake via spot urinary sodium measurements, where someone would just pee in a cup and you measure how much sodium's in that pee, and you can estimate how much salt they're taking in that day.
Sure. And
their blood pressure. And so this intersalt study was referenced everywhere that salt's a problem. Salt causes high blood pressure.
Mm-hmm.
So, it wasn't so easy. You find an article and they reference this one, they reference this one, they go back, and then you start seeing the intersalt study being referenced. So this took a long time. It took a month or two to get to it. And so I read the intersalt study, and the intersalt study looked at blood pressure versus sodium intake, estimated sodium intake. And they reported there's a direct correlation with high blood pressure and sodium intake. And that was the conclusion of the article and in the abstract. Well, I've learned you can't just read abstracts. You got to go through the whole article. So
Absolutely.
I go through the appendix and all that stuff now in every article that I read. And the intersalt study showed, what it really showed was no difference in salt intake and blood pressure in the vast majority of the worldwide centers they studied. That there were areas of the world that had high salt intake and areas of the world that had low salt intake, and there was really no difference in blood pressure. The high and low were not that different because human beings, salt is the second major constituent in our body next to water. We need salt. It's an essential element. We can't manufacture in our bodies. Either we get salt, either we get enough salt in our diet or we're deficient. And, people can die from low salt. And I just had a discussion with a patient this morning. She was on dangerously low salt levels. And I said to her, you get sick with something like COVID or the flu, you're going to be in the hospital because of this. And serious things can happen to you. You could die from this.
Yeah.
I said, you need more salt and you got to start taking it in now. But we can talk about that. But so this intersalt study, when you read into the guts of it, found that the conclusion was ridiculous. So the conclusion, and the conclusion they said, and societies that eat low salt diets have lower blood pressure. So the first premise was wrong. If you looked at it, that high salt diets do not have high blood pressure in these studies in the groups they studied around the world. And the second part was true. The societies that had low salt intake had lower blood pressure. However, there were two areas of the world they studied that found this correlation. One was the Yanomamo Indians, which was a tribe in Brazil that I studied at the University of Michigan. My professor was one of the ones who wrote the early papers on Yanomamo Indians. I knew a lot about them, man. We studied that a lot in anthropology. But when I remember what I knew about the Yanomamo Indians was they died around age 50. They didn't live to old age. So as they got older, the blood pressure didn't go up because they were dead.
Because it was as low as it could be.
Yeah, they had low blood pressure, no question. But they also were eating food grown in the soil and animals they would kill, and they weren't eating all this refined food. And there was no obesity in their population because they couldn't be obese. They had to go get their food.
Right.
And they didn't live a comfort life that we live. And there was another tribe I can't remember that name of that tribe. It was another non-acculturated population that similarly, they died when they were young. Therefore, their blood pressure didn't go up into old age. As we get older, as our arteries get stiffer, our blood pressure goes up naturally. And the reason it goes up is you got to pump blood from the head to the toes or people are going to be fainting all over the place. the arteries and everything else gets stiffer when we're 70 years old versus when we're 20 years old. You need a higher blood pressure for most people to pump that blood.
Right.
So the Intercell study was bogus. It basically, it didn't show anything of the sort of what they actually claimed. When the Intercell study came out, the Surgeon General of the United States went on all the TV shows at the time, the news shows, and in Life magazine, he was put on the cover saying it's a national emergency. We need to lower our salt in our diet to lower our blood pressure. That's where really the force of it came from.
Wow.
Earlier studies that showed when they gave rats huge amounts of salt in their diet, much larger than we would ever eat,
Right.
the rat blood pressure went up
Yeah.
to higher levels. But it was the Intersalt study that gave the fuel behind the push that we need to lower our salt, and that's what took it off from there. And that's where it was in 1970, give or take. So here we are, 55 years later, still suffering the effects of that study, which didn't say anything except for if you die before the age of 50 on average, you won't get high blood pressure because you're not going to grow old. So anyways, so
Wow.
and then I started, going through the research on it, and what it was really interesting with salt. We have this tight range of sodium in our body
Right.
that, the reference range is here to here, but the optimal range of sodium is like here to here. It's really tight.
Yeah.
And the reason our body tightly controls sodium is thousands of different reactions in the body depend on sodium. You can't make ATP, your energy molecules. You can't pump blood because you don't have enough ATP to pump from head to toe. Your nerves function moving sodium atoms, from one synapse to the other, and everything needs sodium. All the cells need sodium in the body,
Absolutely.
and the same goes with chloride. So the number one constituent in the human body is water. Number two is salt, sodium and chloride. If we burned our bodies, there would be over a gram, something like 1.5 grams of sodium and chloride. You don't think that we have much in our bodies. We got a huge body load of sodium and chloride for a reason.
Right.
We were designed that way. And that's why we're designed. That's when they try to lower sodium in our diet and tell us eat 1,000 milligrams of sodium a day or, maximum. People can't stand it. Their food doesn't taste good. They don't like it. And they don't like how they feel on it. And we were not made by our maker to skimp on sodium. Now, can you get too much sodium? Of course, you can get too much anything. You drink too much water.
Right.
If you have normal kidney function, it's pretty hard to get too much sodium. You can pee out a lot of extra sodium if that's the case. But I'm not talking about too much or too little. I'm talking about optimal amounts. And to this day, my patients who will hear this could vouch for me. Every time I do blood work with them, I'm checking their electrolytes. Every time I review their blood work with them, I comment on their sodium levels, sodium and chloride levels. And I talk to them about salt. Are you getting enough salt in? If you're getting a leg cramp or a foot cramp, it's not enough salt, period. End of story. That's so anyways, did all the research on salt, put that into a book. And when I lecture about this, I always dedicate, I have that article, the cut out of the article, and I have a slide of it. And I always dedicate the book and the lecture to the woman who wrote that column.
I hope she hears it someday.
I don't know if she heard it or she didn't hear it, but I didn't ask you, Elaine, do you have a degree in any medical?
I'm a nutritionist, so I have a master's degree in human nutrition and practiced for about 4 years now.
So the resident dietitians have not been real friendly with me. I've had a bone to pick with the RD Association. I can't think of the name of.
I have a bone to pick with them too.
What's the name of that? What's the name of that major organization?
I think it's the American Dietetics Association.
The American Dietetic Association started passing maybe 10 years ago. Started passing laws in the States, and very quietly, that the only people that could talk about nutrition were resident dietitians because no one else could meet the criteria for what they established.
It's the reason I can't practice on my own in Iowa as a nutritionist.
So in Michigan, they passed this law. I heard about it the last second before this was voted on. It was I don't know. We all missed it.
Yeah.
In Michigan, it passed in Michigan, and man, I was irritated.
Yeah.
And I remember my mother was in the hospital for diverticular surgery, and so I go to see her, and she's got her dinner tray out there, and the dinner tray was just garbage,
Right.
just garbage, sugary food. So I took a picture of it, and I wrote a blog post on it, and I commented on the Jello and the this and the that sugar and that sugar and the cookie or something like that.
Right.
And I said, how was she supposed to get well after having a surgery with all this sugar?
Yeah.
And a dietetic association should be ashamed. And so I got all this hate mail from these RDs, and I got on some list, some super secret bad list from the RDs or something like that. And so then they passed this law that they're the only ones who could talk about nutrition.
Yeah.
And I thought it was ludicrous. So I started blogging about that, and I got more hate mail. And then in Michigan, they had a hearing about it. And the other side asked me to come. And
Yeah.
I did. And I gave a little speech about why they shouldn't be the only ones being allowed to talk about nutrition.
Right.
You know, we don't need a law for this. We don't need legislative approval, and we don't need boards for this.
Right.
In Michigan, to my amazement, repealed that law. It was shocking. We actually did it.
Wow.
And
You want to come to Iowa next?
I will come to Iowa. I'm telling you, I like talking about that. But I remember at that meeting, there were some RDs on the other side, and they were so pissed afterwards. They were in my face, and I said, "Look, I'm not saying you can't talk about nutrition. I'm just saying your group should not be telling others they can't talk about nutrition too.
Yeah.
We can all talk about nutrition."
Right.
I said, "I don't agree with what you guys say, but a nutritionist might have a point of view, and it's America. People can decide who they want to hear it from."
Yeah, exactly.
And, but anyways, that's my story on salt and the ADA, and
I
that's
love
where
it.
we are today.
I love it. I mean, what an incredible story, because it's just phenomenal what happens when we start doing the digging, right? Before we started this podcast episode, I was talking to you a little bit about the earlier episodes we did on sugar and how I learned about some of the misunderstanding between salt and hypertension, and while I was doing that research. And it's just like, it's incredible when you actually dig down to the research that is cited again and again and again and again. And it could be cited for decades after we know it's wrong. It's still being cited. And even if 100 studies are done after that original one, and those 100 studies all show that original one is wrong, it doesn't matter. It's like we read that initial study, we made up our mind, and that's it. Like
Same thing happened with COVID. Same thing happened with the COVID vaccines.
Yes.
Witnessed it again. And now things are a little different.
Yeah.
People are a little more savvy. People have the internet. People just don't have to take what their doctor says is the truth, and they can quickly do some research at their own fingertips without having to go to the library or breaking a sweat or going somewhere. And I think we've learned, certainly the last 3.5 years with COVID, that things need to be questioned. And if people weren't sure before COVID, they're sure now. So
absolutely.
things are a little bit easier, and that's the good side of the internet.
I think so too. I agree. Well, so talk to us a little bit on the topic of salt, because, this was the kind of article that this dietitian posted was, no, there's no difference between, regular table salt and unrefined salt, and you shouldn't have either of them. What is the difference? What are some of the differences between that refined table salt and unrefined natural salt?
So earlier, when I started to realize people were deficient in salt and needed salt, I thought, well, what's salt?
Right.
So salt is sodium and chloride. That's what salt is. They're the highest constituent of anything, whether we're talking refined or unrefined. But what I didn't realize, and I had to do the work, was that the refining process of salt. So what they do is they get the salt. Salt comes naturally from where, either through the ocean or through where the ocean was and receded, and such as glaciers or salt deposits somewhere. And the refining process of salt removes the minerals that are in it. So minerals in salt give it a color. Some salts are gray, some salts are red, some salts are yellow, some are brown, depending on what the mineral content is. But unrefined salt has a lot of minerals in it. Refined salt has no minerals in it. It's white, it's bleached, it's got toxic elements like ferrous cyanide and aluminum in it. And that's what refined salt is. Unrefined salt has about 80 trace minerals in it. They're low dose, but these trace minerals are it's if we're looking at the physiology and biochemistry of humans, those trace minerals are all there in salt, and we need them. And many times you just need them in trace amounts.
Right.
So I don't think it takes rocket science to realize for a whole body effect which kind of salt's going to be better for the body, either an unrefined salt with over 80 trace minerals in it or a refined salt with zero trace minerals and some toxic additives added to it. And so once I realized the difference in salt, I started recommending for my patients to use unrefined salt. Over the years, I tested different salt products, and I found 3 brands of salt, pretty clean, lots of good mineral content. They were Selena's Celtic brand sea salt, Redmond salt, and Himalayan salt.
Oh, good. Those are the ones I use, the Selenas and the Redmonds.
Selena's and Redmond's I thought had a better mineral profile. That's my opinion. The best mineral profile of any unrefined salt out there. So I've used those 2 products primarily in my practice for 30 years successfully. And, it's interesting with salt. The body is so tightly wound with salt, so tightly controlled with salt, that if you become deficient in salt, your body usually will start sending signals and you'll start craving salty things and trying to eat more salt. We're conditioned, and I was conditioned in med school, that eating salt causes high blood pressure.
Right.
Well, for the vast majority of people, 99+%, that simply ain't true.
Yeah.
There are a few salt sensitive people that happens. They are few and far between, man.
Right.
It's way less than a patient a year that I see. And, I'm busy practice and, lots of people, and just not common. What is common is that if you put people on a salt deficient diet and their salt levels fall in the reference range from, let's say, here to here, your adrenal glands and your kidney starts triggering hormone release, such as renin and aldosterone, to increase your salt uptake through the kidneys.
Right.
So you don't pee out the salt. Now you reabsorb it.
Right.
And these are powerful hormone modulators to get salt. So what do doctors treat these hormones with, renin and aldosterone? They treat them with anti-renin and anti-aldosterone medications. Those medications are in a class of medications called antihypertensive medications. So when salt levels fall, you lose water volume. Salt's in your fluid to hold water in there. When salt levels go down, your fluid volume shrinks. So you become constricted. Well, to pump blood through a constricted tube, you're going to have to use higher blood pressure. Blood pressure goes up. So what do they use for that? They use medications that block renin and aldosterone. So you relax the blood vessels, but you're not treating the underlying cause of the problem. In this case, the underlying cause of the problem was salt deficiency.
Right.
So it's this whole, I write about that. I do write about that in the book, that, what I titled that chapter was, I just titled it Hypertension and Salt. And, then I read a whole chapter on salt in the adrenal glands, and how important is salt for the thyroid gland because of all these hormones that are secreted to keep us with enough salt, because we can't live without it.
And then these people who are on these medications are being told not to have salt a lot of times, which is then aggravating the original problem.
Yes, it is very aggravating. And it's very aggravating. I used to do that. I didn't know any better. And, many times I find people with hypertension because they're on a low salt diet and they're not drinking enough water. All they have to do is hydrate them, put salt back in their diet, and the blood pressure magically comes down certainly without any medication. And that happens over and over and over in my practice.
Wow.
If you have kidney disease,
right,
you have congestive heart failure, that's another story. Those people do have a hard time sometimes with salt and with decent amounts of salt. You got to be careful with them.
Right.
And look, there is a time and a place for hypertensive diuretic medications.
Right.
I may complain about them a lot, but I do use them. occasionally when they're needed, but they're just not needed nearly as much as they're being used today.
Yeah, and a lot of times I think those things can be kind of a bridge to get you from point A to point B, but they don't have to be continued for a person's lifetime. It's like, yes, let's keep the person alive long enough to get to the root of what's going on and then solve the root of what's going on so that they don't have to be on those medications for the rest of their life. Like, yeah, I'm glad we have them for what we need them for,
Oh,
but
no, we need them. We definitely need them. We don't want to live. We need those medications. They can be life saving and when they're used appropriately.
yeah, absolutely. But like you said, for so many people, there are other options, out there, and ones that will not only address the root cause of the problem, but improve their overall health and longevity in general. What are some of the conditions? You've mentioned a few, the connection with the adrenals, and what are some of the conditions that you see commonly in your practice that can be associated with salt deficiency?
So, um, brain problems, memory problems, fatigue, um, cramps anywhere in the body. You know, cramps in the legs and feet are common with low salt diets, but you can have cramps in elsewhere.
Yeah.
You know, the people are dehydrated often have a hard time rehydrating without salt. If you rehydrate without salt, you can drop the salt levels even further, cause problems. Who was the actress? She was just Brooke Shields. There was just an article I saw online where she drank too much water and she dropped her sodium level so low she had a seizure,
Wow.
and she was rushed to the hospital and was talking about it. And I always tell people to put salt in their water.
Yeah.
If you have a bottle of water, there should be salt in here.
Yeah.
You want to keep your electrolytes up, so you could put a couple of pinches, or if I put a big teaspoon in one of these.
Yeah.
And you get used to it. At first, it might taste a little bit like seawater, but after a while, I don't even taste it.
Yeah.
And my feeling is water and salt go together. You should always have a little pinch of salt in a glass of water. That'll ensure that your electrolytes are going to stay up when you're drinking water. And if you start off low sodium, like that patient I saw today, and she goes and drinks a ton of water, she'll be in the hospital for hyponatremia
Right.
with either seizure or heart arrhythmia or some big problem. And let me tell you, it's not pretty when it happens. And I saw this happen to a lot of COVID patients. They were borderline on their salt levels, and then they got COVID, and their sodium level plummeted, and that's it. These people can't think clearly. They're confused. They need saline IVs to survive.
Right.
And we did a lot of that during COVID in the park, outside in the wintertime and up in Michigan. We put a lot of IVs in to rehydrate people.
Wow. Is immune health then also associated with healthy salt levels?
Oh yeah, nothing works well. The salt is such a crucial. Sodium is such a crucial molecule for cellular function and for hundreds and if not thousands of different reactions in the body that nothing works well. So, but the first thing that goes is brain. They become confused and they become goofy when you talk to them. They answer goofy, they look goofy, their eyes are all glassed over, and they're usually cramping up, and they're miserable.
Yeah.
And it becomes so low they can't they'll start vomiting from it, and they can't drink. So the only way you're going to get the levels up is with an IV.
Wow.
Many times.
Wow. What is the ideal amount of salt? Do you recommend, and is there an amount you recommend, or is it all based on a person's levels that you test in the blood work?
It's different for different people. Everyone's a unique biochemical individual, but generally, as a rule, I'm telling most of my patients when looking at their salt levels who are sodium below 141 milliequivalents per liter, and chloride below 103 milliequivalents per liter, that around a teaspoon a day if you're taking in around 2 liters of water a day. But I have many patients I tell them more, and very few patients I tell them less, unless they have kidney disease or congestive heart failure.
Right. Absolutely. I'm just curious, when we were talking before about the refined salt versus unrefined salt, Do you know what led to the process of refining salt? It's okay if you don't know. I'm just really curious about
I
this.
know.
Why
I
did we
wrote
start
about my book.
bleaching it?
Why do you think? And I'll tell you.
Well, my guess would be that it had something to do with money. Usually, when we're doing something to a product, it's to cut corners and save
Well,
money,
why do they refine oils?
to make them look better because
Okay,
people
so that's
expect
one
things
thing.
to look a
Makes it
certain
look
way.
better. There's two answers there, and I'm not gonna give the second one yet, but they make it look better. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So they refine oils because it looks cleaner. It looks, there's no floaties or anything in there.
Yeah.
They refine salt and they bleach it to make it look white because for some reason the marketing geniuses of the world think white is appealing to the human. White food sources are appealing to, or white salt sources are much more appealing than colored salt sources. And, I'll tell you the truth. If you put up a bottle of Morton's salt compared to like Selena's salt or Redmond salt, Morton salt is pure white salt. I mean, I guess I could say it probably does look a little cleaner, maybe, um, but it's certainly not healthier, and it's not cleaner. It's just the appearances of it. So they
Right.
bleach it, they take the minerals out of it, and then there's some toxic additives from all that process, such as aluminum silicates and you know um, chlorine derivatives because they make it all nice and white. Um, but it's certainly not a healthier product.
Man.
Second, so the money. So the looks was one. Um, so what's the second reason? Why do they? I'm asking you now. I'll answer it. Why do they refine oils besides to make it look better? Same
Um,
reason they refine salt. So they refine a refined food product usually has the natural things taken out of it that can degrade over time.
oh, sure. So to make
So
it like shelf stable,
shelf
basically.
life, shelf life, you got it. So the shelf life of refined salt is forever.
Yeah.
Not going to go anywhere. Shelf life of refined oils, I would imagine it's forever. There's nothing in there that can break down.
Right.
So they make more money on the product.
Yeah.
So they prolong the shelf life with that stuff, and um, that's our country, and that's what's happening. That's we've put shelf life, profits, and appearance over health, and that's why 2/3 of us are overweight and or obese. We have diabetes everywhere, and whatever. I don't have to go into that, but
Yeah. No,
poor
I mean,
health.
it's like the same reason that we make mouthwash bright green or bright blue and kids' cough syrup bright red and like put these toxic dyes into foods that we're eating because for some reason somebody somewhere decided that cough medicine and cough drops need to look bright red.
Yep.
Like, why are we doing this again? What's wrong with the natural color of things? Like in nature, we would have encountered things in their natural state. At what point did we shift so far away from that we need things to be like brightly colored in order to be appealing to eat? Um, wow. Well, I think honestly, we've probably covered a lot of my questions that I had for you. And I think the interesting thing in the history of salt and salt being so vilified, is there anything else there in that history that we didn't talk about that you wanted to share?
Well, I would just no, nothing in the history. I mean, just you know, I, for 30 years I've been lecturing and writing books. I got 17 books out. I write a national newsletter, and you know, whatever, just trying to educate people, because educated patients are better patients. I've certainly learned that lesson. And so I used to tell patients, do your own, I would still say the same thing, do your own research. I always tell my patients, look, you're driving the car. I'm just on the side of the street yelling, go left, go right, go straight. You decide where the car is going.
Yeah.
And I'll keep yelling, and if they turn right and I say turn left, I'll catch up to them and keep yelling. Um, but patients ultimately, in charge of their healthcare decisions. But I can be there to help them. And I used to tell them that don't believe everything you hear. Don't believe everything you hear from me. Go back and do your research with it. After COVID, I don't know if I necessarily have to tell anyone that anymore, because it's pretty apparent. You can't believe everything you hear.
Right.
And with COVID, everything was a lie from the beginning of it. And
Yeah.
here we are 3.5 years later and $15 trillion down the tubes for what? We're still getting COVID. It's still around. And, we had all those people die because they were told to go home, don't do anything till you can't breathe, and show up in the air where they thought they were helping the patients, but they weren't. And there were safe and effective therapies then. There's safe and effective therapies now. And just, anyways, do your own research. And, if it doesn't sound right, many times it's not.
Yeah.
And if you're not feeling good, keep searching, because there's ways out there, and there's holistic ways to support the biochemistry of the body. We should be supporting the biochemistry of the body, not blocking and poisoning it with drugs that block and poison receptors.
Right. Absolutely. Well, a question about your practice. Do you see any people virtually, or do you work all just like brick and mortar?
We'll see people virtually, but we like to see them the first time in person.
Yeah.
And I don't like virtual medicine. I don't feel I'm old school.
Yeah.
I work with a pen and a paper. I don't work with a computer. I still touch my patients. I still palpate them.
Yeah.
I know how to palpate the thyroid, and I know how to palpate the body. And it's not my favorite way of doing things, but once we see somebody and we establish a relationship, you could do many things virtually for a while, and then, periodically get together. But we like them to come in the first time.
Yeah.
To do an in-person visit. And
what was the name of your practice again?
Center for Holistic Medicine. It's in West Bloomfield, Michigan. I have a website. It's Dr. Brownstein, BROWNSTEIN.com, where all my books are. And check us out. We like what we're doing. We have fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, so for anybody who's in the Michigan area and wants to check out the practice, then I would strongly recommend you go do that and set up a relationship with them. And then for anybody who's far away, check out Dr. Brownstein's books, because obviously, Dr. Brownstein, you are a wealth of knowledge. This is incredible. I could talk to you for hours. And so it'd be great, just to have you on again on the podcast, talk about some of the other topics that I know you've covered and written about. But for anybody who's listening who wants to learn more from Dr. Brownstein, definitely check out his website. I'll link it in the show notes, and be sure to check out some of the books that he's written as well. Dr. Brownstein, is there anything else you want to say in closing?
Thank you for having me on. And I would again say, if you're not getting answers, you're not happy, you're not being treated appropriately, then find someone who will treat you appropriately, because that's how it should be done in medicine.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. That's perfect. Great. What a great message for our listeners to leave with. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Brownstein. We really appreciated having you on. I've been so grateful that you're sharing your time and your expertise with us. And I think this is a very valuable episode for our listeners. And for sure, we'll have you back on again. And
good.
Thank you, listeners, for tuning in today. And as always, go be renegades.
Thank you for listening to the Renegade Nutrition Podcast.
Please keep in mind that this podcast is an educational service that provides general health information. The content on this podcast is not a substitute for direct, personal, professional medical care and diagnosis. You should always talk to your doctor before making a dietary or lifestyle change. Go be renegades!
Go be renegades!